Reading with your kids.
Hola, niho, konnichiwa, assalamu alaikum, shalom, mahaba, moni miliwanji, namaste, jumbo, bienvenidos. Hi, my name is Jevly, and this is the Reading with Your Kids podcast. We are coming to you from the oh-so-beautiful neighborhood of Reedville in the southwest corner of Boston, Massachusetts. We are so honored and so very happy that you're joining us in our mission to help all families grow closer through reading. Please be sure to tell all of your family and friends about the show. And please be sure to subscribe to the show on the iHeartRadio app, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, wherever you find your podcast. Our guest today is Jen de Oliveira. She is here to celebrate her graphic novel, Reggie, Kid Penguin. Before we invite Jen into the studio, we want to let you know that this episode of the Reading with Your Kids podcast is brought to you by Jack and the Crunchy Leaves, my first hearing aid. A heartwarming journey that will touch your soul and open young minds to the power of acceptance. Written by Ken Hyder. Join Jack as he explores a world of newfound sounds and understanding through his journeys with hearing aids. This captivating story doesn't just entertain, it educates children about the importance of empathy, embracing differences, and the remarkable impact of these tiny devices. Get your copy now on Amazon in paperback, ebook, and even the delightful companion coloring book. Let's embark on a learning adventure together. Jack and the Crunchy Leaves, my first hearing aids, written by Ken Hyder. It's fabulous. You and your kids are going to love it. This episode of the podcast is also brought to you by Traveling Tootsies, written by sisters Karen and Kathy Honecker. Are you looking for ways to instill the love of travel in your kids? Check out one of our Reading with Your Kids certified great reads. It's Traveling Tootsies, an enchanting children's book that follows the adventures of Katie, Stephen, and their teddy bear Tootsie. Katie and Stephen devise a clever plan that allows Tootsie to experience the wonders of Washington, D.C. The excitement builds as Tootsie embarks on an unexpected journey secretly stashed away in her father's suitcase. Will Tootsie be able to make it back to Katie and Stephen in time to share the awe-inspiring experiences he encountered during his trip? Traveling Tootsies weaves together themes of adventure, imagination, and family bonds. This really is a beautiful book, and it is a Reading with Your Kids certified great read. It belongs in your family library. It's Traveling Tootsie by Karen and Kathy Honecker. Join us right now from the great state of California. Our guest is here today to celebrate her debut graphic novel for young kids. It's called Reggie, Kid Penguin. Please welcome to the show, Jen de Oliveira. Hey, Jen, how are you?
Hey, thanks for having me, Jed. It's great to be here.
I'm really excited that you're on. You are the author and illustrator of Reggie, Kid Penguin. And so tell us all about the book, please.
Well, this is the first in a series about Reggie. He's an anthropomorphic penguin, and the book is a collection of little short stories told through comics of Reggie's everyday adventures. So they take little small moments that kids have, like getting ready for picture day, but accidentally giving himself a haircut and needing to work that out. He gets into little mischief because he's such a curious little guy. He has an older cousin who takes him on a walk in the park, but she doesn't quite trust him enough, so she puts him on a kid leash, which is very upsetting to him. And then he gets the idea of running around the neighborhood acting like a dog. So Reggie finds a way to get into mischief, but always kind of finds a creative way out of that mischief.
Well, I don't blame Reggie because I'll be honest with you, I would have been upset if somebody put a leash on me when I was a kid, and we never put leashes on our kids. So
Yeah.
I can relate to Reggie. First question I have to ask. I received my copy of Reggie, Kid Penguin earlier, about an hour ago, and I had just enough time to to open up the envelope and take a look at the cover art, which is fantastic, and kind of just open up the book and thumb through it really quickly. And my first thought, and you use the word, so I think it's okay, but my first thought was, wow, what a cool comic book. Mm-hmm. And I know that in the publishing world, I don't hear that word very often. We hear graphic novel or graphic novel for young kids. Have we started using the word graphic novel to describe what we would typically call comic books because schools won't buy comic books? Because comic books aren't considered literature, whereas graphic novels are. And I'll be honest with you, it took me a long time to accept that graphic novels were literature. When my kid loved them, I didn't give him or the books enough respect. So I'm guilty. So if they're doing that for, to help dumb parents like I was, I'm all for it.
Yeah, and I think there has been, over the last few years, this kind of shift in acceptance and also accessibility to comics. And a lot of that credit is for the grown-ups who are kind of the gatekeepers for those books. And a lot of that, it goes to the credit of librarians and teachers for validating those books and making them accessible to kids. But I think just in a technical sense, I have no issue with people referring to Reggie as a comic. In my own classroom library, I'd have tubs that would say comic books and graphic novels to kind of use that those phrases kind of interchangeably. But I think from what I understand in like a technical sense, comic books refer to what we think of like the old Archie comics or Marvel comics that you would get in the supermarket or a comic shop. That's kind of these like flimsy paper covers. And so I believe like technically that is what distinguishes comic books from graphic novels. But really I call Reggie a comic because the form that I use is comics to tell the stories. So I don't have an issue with it being referred to comic or graphic novel. Yeah.
And I grew up as a huge fan of comics, and we've talked a lot about, just how popular comics are and how much fun they are. In fact, I've told this story on the podcast in the past. There was a huge newspaper strike here in Boston when I was a kid. And at that time, Boston had 3 newspapers, and all 3 of them went dark. They weren't able to publish. But the news channels all had a segment where they were reading the comic strips that would have appeared in that day's edition, so that people, especially if there's a serial comic, people could keep up with the stories. And that's how important comics were back 100 years ago when I was a kid.
Yeah, I'm actually also the co-creator of something called Sunday Haha with fellow author illustrator Mika Song. And that started up in the pandemic. And so the concept behind that was like the Sunday Funnies, but this is a digital version that gets emailed to your inbox. It's free to sign up. But it was interesting because we initially made it for kids who didn't have access to books because they were at home when the pandemic started. The schools closed their doors and libraries and places had to close their doors. So we made that as a way for kids to be able to read comics and have something kind of fun and comforting during that really uncertain time. But we heard a lot from grown-ups who mentioned the same thing, that it reminded them of when they were kids, or reading with an adult, the Sunday Funnies, and how they look forward to that every Sunday. So that's been something very sweet to hear, that Sunday Haha has become that to a lot of families, that they look forward to opening their email Sunday morning to read the comic strips in their inbox.
Well, that is awesome. I'm going to have to subscribe to that. Mika was also a guest here on the podcast, and we love her work, and I love your work. I'm so glad that you're here. And can you talk just a little bit more about the power of telling stories through these little panels? It's such an interesting art form.
Yeah, I mean, when I started working on this book, I really had to ask myself, what is the best way to tell Reggie's story? because as a longtime classroom teacher, I have all sorts of books that I read aloud and have for my kids, picture books, chapter books, early chapter books. But with Reggie, because he's so animated and has so much emotion that in one panel he'll be grumpy and the next moment he's elated. I thought the format of comics was just really the best way to tell his story, because so much of it is told visually, but different than in picture books where you have fewer pictures and like larger spreads to tell the stories. I really needed those kind of moment to moment pictures to really have readers get the full experience of Reggie and what he's feeling.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that Mika shared with us was that when she, I think it was Pizza My Heart, when she was creating that character, she thought, okay, I'm going to have to draw this character a couple hundred times for this book, so I'm going to make it as simple as possible, make it easy for me. Is that, as an illustrator, was that something that you thought of as you were creating Reggie?
Absolutely. When you work in comics, you have to realize that you're drawing that character over and over and over in the panels. And Reggie is an 80-page comic, which is on the shorter side, but still a lot of Reggies in that book. But before Reggie was a book, he was a webcomic, a 4-panel webcomic that I did. And so because I worked on the character for a couple years prior to the book, by the time the book came around, I had sort of streamlined his design a little bit to make him easier for me to draw and more efficient.
Yeah. I think that this is so fascinating. One of the things I love about doing this podcast is because I'm not a visual artist myself, I get a chance to speak to phenomenal artists like you and Mika and learn a little bit about your process, learn some of those secret shortcuts that, kind of make your life a little bit easier.
Yeah, I mean, comics really, what I love about comics is they're for everybody. Like, everyone can enjoy reading them, but really anyone can make a comic also. I find that it's a little less intimidating than being a picture book illustrator, because you're kind of, as a picture book illustrator, you have these beautiful spreads, and it's the book. And with a comic, it's kind of the sum of all the parts. So you just think about the purpose of each panel is to tell this greater story. So it makes it a really fun and also challenging format, but it's a fun challenge.
Yeah. One of the things that we've talked about here in the podcast is how difficult it is to write a children's book. I've heard authors of these massive novels kind of look down their nose and think, children's book, you can put one of those out in a weekend, 600 words. But the reality is telling a story in 600 words is really challenging. Telling a story in 4 panels and, I don't know, maybe 24 words or 36 words, that could be even a greater challenge. Talk a little bit about that and how you're able to accomplish that.
Yeah, the 4-panel comics were for the comic strip. So definitely that is a challenge where you have a really short amount of space to deliver a quick story. So it kind of has a beginning, some kind of conflict, and then a punchline or something at the end. So like I said, Reggie is based on the kids that I've worked with over the years. So he lent himself really well to comic strips, because as a teacher, you always see these tiny moments throughout the day that are just like funny little snapshots of what it's like to be a kid. So with Reggie, it's like each little tiny snapshot becomes its own comic strip. But then when I have the book, the challenge there was being able to tell something within 80 pages. I was given an 80-page count limit. And so for Reggie, because he came from comic strips, which were very, very short, those short stories grew a little bit, but it's a collection of shorter stories. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. How do you like this new, larger format as opposed to the short 4-panel comic strips? Was it more freeing being able to have 80 pages and, I don't know, what does that work out to, a couple hundred panels? Or was it intimidating, like, how am I going to fill all those pages?
A little bit, because when you're doing a comic strip, you either have 3 or 4 panels or however many you've set up for yourself. And the challenge is just what are you going to show to communicate to the reader? But once you're doing a comic book, you have to decide how you're laying out those pages. So actually, in the graphic novel, each page fits about 6 panels. It's not a 4-panel page. So sometimes there's 6 panels, but then it's very mathematical in a way, because it's almost like you're working off a grid and you're deciding how many panels do I need to tell this moment in the story. So there's a lot more variation. And in some ways it is freeing because you can show things differently than you could in a comic strip. But then there's that added challenge of how many panels do I need to show this? And I was very conscious of those page turn beats, so that when you get to the end of a page, you want to flip the page and see what's next. So definitely making sure that the panel structure fit that, so that every page kind of lands at a moment where you want to turn to the next one.
Yeah. So all those folks that are listening to this, writing those big, massive novels, there's a lot more to it than just putting 600 words on a piece of paper.
Yeah, it's one of those things where doing something that looks simpler or having to simplify isn't always easier. Mm-hmm. And I think that's kind of a good metaphor too, when you're thinking about children, is I think people who don't work with children or write for children, it's easy to think, oh, they're simple. They, simply entertained. It doesn't take much, but that's not true. I mean, they still have a lot of emotions and experiences. You just have to adapt that to where they are. And that's something I really try to be intentional about with Reggie, is he is a funny little kid penguin and silly moments happen. But I also wanted to be really honest and acknowledge that kids have a range of emotion. They get frustrated. They get grumpy. They can problem solve. So I really wanted to respect kids and have that respect for kids, to show that like they are full little people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I wanted to touch on that idea of the kids and the audience that you're creating for. As a teacher, you've been working with kids. One of the things I was amazed at when I coached a high school sports team, I realized that kids were spending more time with me than they were with their parents. The 3 hours they were with me on the field, they'd go home and they're there in the house for longer, but between dinner and homework and TV and sleeping, they might have been only spending a half an hour, 45 minutes interacting with their parents. As a teacher with kids all day long, you're interacting with those kids for hours and hours and hours every day. First, have you noticed, have kids changed? You and I were talking about how being a teacher has changed over the years. Have kids changed in your experience as a teacher?
I've been teaching for about 15 years. And so we were talking prior to this about definitely a shift in the system of education, mm-hmm. and the demands on educators, and a lot of times the lack of support that's making the job so challenging. Same thing with librarians. A lot of demands being put on them, and not a lot of trust to let them do their jobs. As far as kids, I would say yes and no. I mean, it's because the world has changed a lot, right, over the last 10 years. And so in some ways, I think kids are always kids. But there's so many things that kids are exposed to now. I mean, we had the pandemic where I had several years of kids that were doing first grade on Zoom, which is, I could never imagine that in the past. But, I was so impressed during that year and a half a year, end of the school year when the pandemic started. So I finished a school year on Zoom and then did the next full school year on Zoom. And kids are so resilient and they adapt. And I was so impressed with them showing up on their little computer or tablet. And a lot of times they were in their pajamas, still eating their breakfast. And it was kind of a very humbling experience. And I still feel a deep connection to those kids I had that year, because we got to know each other on a level that you don't normally get to know your students. We were like in each other's homes and seeing this very vulnerable side. So yeah, I was very impressed with the way the kids just, that's all they knew. What other choice did they have? So they did the best that they could with the situation. But there are a lot of challenges for kids now that I think cause a lot of anxiety and uncertainty. We have a lot of wildfires, extreme heat in the area where I live, where kids don't go out to play because the air quality is not good or it's too hot. And then, of course, lockdown drills and things that are scary for little kids. So when I wrote Reggie, it was kind of just out of pure joy and a desire to bring something fun for kids, because the reality is kids these days do have a lot of scary and things that they have to think about. And I think it is important to have all kinds of books accessible to them, but also fun books that they can escape with and just be a kid, have the fun of being a kid and enjoying something silly. I
agree. I recently rediscovered the Looney Tune cartoons, which it's just, there's pretty much no moral, no lessons, to just, we're going to have fun with Bugs and the Wile E. Coyote and the Roadrunner, and there's certainly nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, I grew up loving animation, and that's actually was how I got into making art, is because I wanted to work in animation. And so I agree. I mean, I know I turn to those things a lot too when I just want to be comforted and have something fun. Is I turn on some of my favorite animated shows or movies.
We were talking earlier about your process. I'm curious, as an author illustrator, one of the things I often ask people who are author illustrators, are you an illustrator that writes or an author who draws? Does it depend on the project you're working at? Does it vary from one book to another?
Yeah, I think it kind of varies, but because I always considered myself an artist first, like as a kid, I loved to draw. I went to college and studied illustration and animation. I think I consider myself an artist first. But especially with comics, you're doing both things at once. You're writing and illustrating, and that writing may not always look like text on a page. You're kind of writing through pictures.
Yeah. As you're working out the stories in your mind, are you seeing images first? Is the humor coming from the images that you're putting together, or are you coming up with one-liners that you find really funny?
It just kind of depends. I mean, with the comic strip, definitely I would think of a little moment like, oh, that was funny when a kid said that. Now, how would Reggie do that? Or what would I show for Reggie? Sometimes, I really love working with characters. So Reggie is a series. I'm hoping to create more children's book series because I love that episodic, element where a character and then you get to see them again in another book and again in another book. So sometimes when I know a character well enough, and I'm just doing something around the house, like I hear them in my head, like I can hear them saying something or doing something, and that little moment is a spark for something in a story.
Yeah. I know, and again, we touched on this earlier, and I'm mentioning this for all the parents out there who, like me, loved comics. When my son discovered anime and manga, I supported it and would bring it home. But I also, when he was in high school, there were many times when I would walk into his room and say, please, can you read one book that doesn't have a picture in it? And I didn't fully appreciate the fact that he was reading, that the stories that he was reading in those magazines were stories. It was literature. They were filled with great characters and situations. And so I just want to mention that. And for all the parents who are out there who haven't developed an appreciation for the fact that reading graphic novels, reading comics, reading anime, it's reading. And if that's what your kids are reading right now, celebrate it. I didn't celebrate it enough at the time, so I'm really encouraging everybody to celebrate it. Thankfully, I didn't mess my kid up. He still loves reading and reading anime and all of that. So I'm thankful that I didn't mess him up.
Thank you for mentioning that. I will say that I just listened to a podcast the other day called Book Delight with Chrissy Wright, W-R-I-G-H-T, and she's a librarian in the Pacific Northwest. And she just had a great episode addressing exactly what you said, why reading graphic novels is real reading. So that's a really great one to listen to if grownups are still kind of on the fence or curious to kind of dive more into that. And something I've always talked to about reading with my students when, because I've taught first grade most recently, and they're learning to read. And the main thing we talk about is reading is thinking, right? Reading is making connections. And especially when kids are in kindergarten and first grade and still learning the act of reading and the sounds that letters make and what words are, reading pictures is a very valuable skill because they tell a lot of the story. So I feel like we need to embrace that and not feel like once you transition to reading words, you can graduate from pictures, because pictures and words, when they're done very well, they both enhance a story. And so with comics, a lot of the reading is making those visual connections and comprehending what's happening.
Yeah. And this actually just occurred to me right now. We're entering an age, and whether you think it's good or not doesn't really matter, because we're entering the age where more and more kids are experiencing story through images more and more. There's, most of the media that kids are consuming these days is on Instagram or Facebook or TikTok. And so they're seeing images, they're seeing videos. And if they can become more literate in terms of looking at pictures and, really kind of deciphering what's going on in a story, the whole story through pictures, I think that that's going to be a real benefit for them as they spend more and more time on social media.
Absolutely. Yeah. The discussion about visual literacy being a really important skill is absolutely, like you mentioned. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. We should tell everybody where they can go to find out more about Reggie Kid Penguin and more about you, and also more about the project that you and Mika are working on.
Yeah, so Mika and I are still the editors of Sunday Haha. So if you go to sundayhaha.com, you can sign up for free to get the newsletter delivered to your inbox. For my own personal work, reggiecomic.com is my website, so you can find out about the book. This fall, I'll be able to share the cover and the title of the second Reggie book. And I'll also have some content up there for grown-ups and kids, like printable pages that connect to the book, comics pages, and then some fun videos and drawing tutorials for kids. So I'm in the process of getting that up on the website soon.
Awesome. Drawing tutorials. We love that. We love that. We've had a great time speaking to the author and illustrator of Reggie Kid Penguin, the debut graphic novel for kids, from our guest, Jen D'Oliveira. Jen, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It was great to talk to you today.
Please be sure to join us for the next episode of the Reading with Your Kids podcast. Our guest will be Kelly Starling Lyons. She'll be here to celebrate Miles Lewis, track star. That's the next episode of the podcast. Hey, we want to encourage all the authors listening to the show to check out our website, readingwithyourkids.com, and click on the Authors Click Here button up at the top of the page to learn how you can submit your book to our Reading with Your Kids Certified Great Read panel, and also learn how you can take part in our monthly promotion programs. Speaking of Certified Great Reads, we want to thank the folks who made today's show so wonderful. Of course, we want to start by thanking our guest, Jen D'Oliveira. Please be sure to check out Reggie Kid Penguin. We also want to thank Traveling Tootsies, the wonderful picture book by Karen and Kathy Honecker. It is a Reading with Your Kids certified great read. We also want to thank Jack and the Crunchy Leaves, my first hearing aids, written by Ken Hyder. I want to thank my team. They're amazing. Fatima Khan, Rory Grady, Soji Franklin, Ann O'Leary. I want to thank my beautiful wife for all the support she gives me. Most of all, we all want to thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. And as always, thank you so very much for taking the time to make the world a better place. And you do that every single time you read with your kids. I'll be looking for you in the next edition of the Reading with Your Kids podcast.